What if everything you thought you were, your name, your roles, your story, suddenly collapsed like a house of cards? What if the person you've been defending your whole life was never really you at all? This is the strange and haunting truth I discovered when my identity shattered and something far deeper began to emerge. I used to think I knew myself. I had a life others called stable, a good job, a few small achievements that made my family proud, relationships that weren't deep but kept my social life intact. Every day moved in a predictable rhythm, and I simply followed it. I never paused to ask why I was on that path. It didn't seem wrong, so I kept walking. I lived like someone unremarkable, neither brilliant nor failed, and that felt acceptable. Then one afternoon, sitting alone in my usual room, the place I read or hide from the city noise, I felt a sudden, odd emptiness. Nothing dramatic had happened. No loss, no shock, only a quiet. From that silence, a question rose, like something from the bottom of a deep lake. Who am I? At first, I dismissed it as a passing philosophical thought, a line I had read somewhere in an old book. But the question didn't drift away like other thoughts. It held on to me, not in a frightening way, but as something quietly gentle and insistently weighty, not heavy with words, but heavy with an unexamined presence. I sat motionless for nearly an hour, staring into the space in front of me, simultaneously lost and awakened. I had believed I was my name, my job, my memories, my relationships. When that question arrived truly, all of those labels peeled away like paint. I didn't change overnight. The shift was internal and slow, like an underground river altering a landscape without fanfare. Everything I did, everything I thought, felt watched by an inner eye asking, who is doing this? Who is thinking that? I had no answer, and strangely, not having one made me feel I was stepping into uncharted land. I told no one. Most would call it a mental game, a passing fantasy, or a mild midlife crisis. But to me, it was an inner summons, quiet, urgent, and so true I could not pretend not to hear it. Once you hear it, you can't go back to living carelessly. You know, behind all the daily actions there is something waiting to be recognized, a thing without a name. Without it, everything else feels hollow. I can't point to a single moment when the crisis began. It didn't arrive like a storm, but like a tiny crack that slowly widened. At first, life simply dulled. Tasks that once felt meaningful became mechanical. Conversations that used to bring light now left a nameless silence. I felt like an actor who no longer believed in the role. The script stayed the same, but I could not summon conviction. Outside, everything looked fine. Inside, something was collapsing. I lost interest in things that used to excite me. Goals, plans, small pleasures. I woke each morning with a question hovering in my head. What is all this for? Gradually, I felt confined in a transparent box. I could see everything, but nothing felt connected. Even in a crowd, I felt profoundly alone. Not for lack of company, but for lack of myself. I did the job, visited family, smiled with friends, but like a machine, everything was correct by expectation and duty, yet utterly soulless. Sleep fled me, not from stress, but because my mind had nowhere to anchor. I lay staring at the ceiling, while questions carved into my chest. Who am I in this wide world? Does life have a purpose? Or is it just a loop of roles and reactions? If I die tomorrow, what remains? That was my first understanding of existential crisis. It is different from ordinary sadness. It is not about a single event, and it cannot be healed with simple advice or a positive mindset. It's like a pit opening in the middle of everyday life. Though I still breathed and lived, I felt I was falling toward nothingness. All former meanings, fame, money, recognition, suddenly lost their power. I didn't want to die. I simply could not explain why I still wanted to live. I could not tell anyone because common advice, travel, change your environment, see a doctor, misses the point. How could I explain that the emptiness I felt could not be filled by anything external? The issue was not lack, but the dawning realization that everything I had valued carried no weight when set against the question of being. I knew if I didn't honestly face that void, I would spend the rest of my life as a talking shell, performing, repeating, convincing myself that everything was fine. I could not accept that. I didn't know what I wanted. I only knew I could not return to who I was before. This is the honest center of the story. The moment when appearances no longer satisfy and the inner question demands answering, not for others, but for the life you still have to live. If you ever feel something similar, a quiet fracture, a question that will not go, understand this. It is not a failure. It is an invitation to look deeper. You may lose comforts and certainties along the way, but you will also begin a search that asks for truth rather than comfort. I speak from the edge of that first hour, from where I stood unready and curious, afraid and strangely hopeful. And I continue because the question, who am I, keeps shaping the life I am learning to live. The question, who am I, became a fire that stripped away every layer of paint covering the surface. And now, I was left exposed, with nothing to hold on to, no comforting answer to lean on, no clear direction to follow. But I knew I could not stand still. I had to move into the vast unknown, not because I wanted to, but because there was simply no other way forward. And I secretly hoped that somewhere in this emptiness, some form of truth might reveal itself. As this existential storm inside me grew wider, I realized I couldn't just sit and wait for a miracle. I needed to act, to search for a way out, or at least a temporary answer to the fire burning within. Not knowing where to begin, I turned to books. From mainstream self-help guides to ancient philosophy, I read everything I could, hoping that somewhere in those words, someone, some teacher, philosopher, or wise soul had faced this same question before, and that they would hand me a convincing, usable answer. For a short while, I thought I had found it, a definition of identity, a sense of purpose, something that sounded solid. I clung to it like a lifeline. I began labeling myself with new identities. I am responsible. I am a seeker of truth. I am awake among the unaware. And for days, even weeks, I felt lighter, convinced I was closer to the answer. But soon, like a cycle pre-written, the feeling faded. Every new label I held on to eventually crumbled. One bad day, one unexpected failure, and I fell back into the same abyss. I realized these identities were nothing more than refined masks, pretty on the surface, fragile underneath. So I turned to people. I asked friends, mentors, those I thought had wisdom. Some told me to practice spirituality. Others said work harder to stay grounded. Some said I was overthinking. Others told me to seek faith. I tried them all. Meditation, new career goals, even prayer. But none erased the question. It only stepped aside, waiting to return. Sometimes in moments of joy, sometimes in praise from family, it resurfaced. A whisper inside, is this really me? I tried escaping, burying myself in social media, binge watching, shallow relationships, endless events. It made me busy, but also exhausted. And when night came, when the world grew silent, the old question returned. It didn't need to scream. Its quiet repetition was enough to shake me. At times, I grew frustrated with myself. Why couldn't I just live like everyone else? But after the anger came a deep, indescribable sadness, and I knew I could never go back. I stopped believing that anyone or anything outside could give me the answer. Every answer I once chased, no matter how noble, revealed itself as another illusion, a mask pretending to be me. I realized there were only two paths left: either keep circling the maze of fake answers, or turn and face directly the one that asks the question, not to answer it, but to see it. That was the moment my real journey began. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, during ordinary moments, when someone praised me for being kind, or when I forced a smile to please family while feeling irritated inside. Each time, I noticed there were two layers, one playing the role and another silently watching. At first, I thought it was exhaustion, but gradually, I saw it more clearly. I wasn't living as myself, but as an image of who I thought I should be. I saw the labels I had carried since childhood: good child, talented one, responsible, idealistic. They once gave me value, but now looked like stacked shells. None of them was me. One night, I sat in front of the mirror, not to fix anything, but simply to face the other one, the one who had lived with me all these years, yet now felt like a stranger. If everything people knew about me vanished, my name, my past, my job, who would remain in that reflection? The face looked back, familiar yet unfamiliar, and I felt like a stranger inside my own skin. I remembered every stage of life where I wore a role. A failure made me worthless. Praise made me special. Heartbreak turned me into the victim. And standing among the successful made me feel invisible. Like an actor changing costumes, I kept shifting. But then I saw the truth. Those roles only existed because I believed in them. No one forced me to wear those masks. I chose them to cover something more fragile, more raw, deep inside. For the first time, I looked directly at the ego, not as a concept, but as something operating within me every single moment. It wasn't distant, it was alive. A system that constantly created an image of me, then fought to protect it. When someone criticized, it reacted. When someone praised, it celebrated. When I felt alone, it pretended to be full. When I was afraid, it wore calmness as armor. Behind it all was a silent emptiness, not an answer, not an identity, but pure presence, watching, quietly aware of everything. At first, I was terrified, as if being stripped bare, but with that fear came an indescribable lightness, because for the first time, I didn't need to play any role. I was simply watching. I am not a good person, and I am not a bad person. I am not anything that can be neatly defined. I am simply aware, and that awareness carries a strange kind of freedom. From that moment on, I began to sense something beyond the masks I had worn. There was something silently watching, not part of those masks, yet fully present. It stood unmoved, needing no proof, simply witnessing everything I once mistook for me. I did not understand what it truly was, but I knew this: if there was anything worth seeking, it wasn't what I had believed myself to be. For years, I thought if I could expose the roles, the layers, the reflexes I called myself, I would finally be free. I thought simply seeing the illusion was enough to walk away from it. But I was wrong. Recognizing the ego is not like taking off an old coat and walking away. It is more like watching the very house you lived in collapse before your eyes. And in that moment, you lose not just your shelter, but the very idea of who you thought you were. What I believed to be me no longer stood, not because someone proved me wrong, but because I myself saw the raw truth. It was all temporary. For the first time, I had nothing left to lean on. I no longer knew what I was. I no longer dared to claim anything about myself. And strangely, I no longer needed to. If I had to name the feeling, it was a quiet dissolution, not painful, but cold, like watching yourself shatter into pieces of glass. Those fragments reflected light beautifully, but they no longer served any use. I no longer wanted to prove anything. I no longer knew what to pursue, and in that emptiness, I stopped resisting. That was what shocked me the most. I was not suffering. There was a deep, gentle sadness, but it did not pull me down. Instead, it allowed me to breathe, naturally, freely, as if for the first time. I was no longer anyone at all, and yet I was still here, not with a new identity, but with no need for one. I was simply present, nameless, without description, without reason. A strange silence filled my mind. The sky was still blue, the wind still moved, people still walked by, but everything appeared more alive, not because they changed, but because I was no longer looking through the lens of me. The death of the ego does not arrive in a grand, glorious moment, as the books often say. It comes quietly, as everything you once clung to slowly falls away, and you no longer chase after it. I began learning how to simply exist, in silence, in presence, and in that very dissolution, something new was born. Not a new self, but an open space, where no old definition could stick. Something deeper was emerging, wordless, untouchable, yet undeniably present. I do not yet know what it is, but for the first time, I am not rushing to define it. I only know this: truth is not found in answers. It is revealed after the collapse of everything we once thought was real, and I am standing right there, in that space where every definition has fallen away, and something radiant, silent, and alive is quietly appearing. In that moment, I didn't really know what I was doing. I simply stopped doing anything at all. I just sat there, no meditation, no seeking, no effort to become someone. Maybe you could call it exhaustion after wandering too long in the maze of identity, or maybe it was surrender. But in that surrender, there was no anger, no expectation, no goal, only stillness. A stillness that asked for nothing, forced nothing, but was always there, waiting quietly, like it had been with me all along. At first, thoughts still came, familiar patterns like echoes on repeat. What am I doing here? Shouldn't I be working, achieving, doing something useful? But this time, I didn't chase them. I didn't fight, didn't agree, didn't resist. I simply watched, not through the eyes of analysis, but as if something behind me, silent and clear, was quietly witnessing it all. And then, in a moment not dramatic at all, I realized something was simply aware. It knew there were thoughts, a breath, the weight of my hands resting on my legs. But this awareness didn't speak, didn't claim, didn't need a name. It just was, quiet, nameless, formless, yet unmistakably real. For the first time, I felt a peace unlike anything I had known before. Not the peace of finishing a task, not the comfort of someone's embrace, but peace because there was no reason left to be restless. No one to protect, nothing to defend, nothing to prove, just pure presence, simple and complete. Thoughts still came and went like breezes across the surface of water, but now I was no longer the water being disturbed. I was the space holding the water itself. I realized this quiet awareness had always been here. I had just been too busy being someone to notice. And then the old burning question, Who am I? Lost all its weight, not because I answered it, but because it no longer mattered. It was like waking from a dream and realizing the question that haunted you in sleep has no meaning in daylight. In that silence, I no longer needed to be somebody. I didn't vanish, but I also wasn't confined to a single name, role, or story. I was both nothing and everything, like a wave finally realizing it had always been the ocean. So maybe the truth isn't something you find at the end of a long search. Maybe it's what remains when all the searching falls away. A quiet, radiant presence that was never gone, only waiting to be seen. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If today's story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to walk this path with me, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories every week. Wishing you peace wherever you are.